from the future, and I'm putting this in front of what you'll be seeing about Thomas Bernhard and my initial thoughts about this autofiction or novel called Wittgensteins Nephew. And I wanted to tell you his dates, so from when he lived, and I never mentioned it in there, and also when this book was published. So he was born February 9th, 1931, and he lived until February 12th, 1989. So 58. So, you know, he did grow up with some understanding of the Nazi dictatorship, etc., and the war, of course. He's a couple of years younger than my dad, who was born 28. And Wittgenstein's Nephew, this novel that I'll talk about soon, was published in 1982, but the actual events take place in the 60s. So when they're both in this world, of course the events go back and forth, and he has memory of his whole friendship with this person, with Paul Wittgenstein, but they're in the sanatorium, sort of the setting when it starts out in the 60s, so 67, I think. But it does kind of go back and forth in time. Just wanted to get that on there, so you, because you might be wondering, well, what are his dates? And now I will let the video play. Bye. Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you about the book that I finished reading a few days ago, Thomas Bernhard's Wittgensteins Nephew, and of course I read it in the German. So this is the second book by Thomas Bernhard that I read. The first one was Holzfällen, so wood cutting, and for that one, I guess for both of them, I really didn't know a lot about Thomas Bernhard. I didn't know that much about him except from what I'd gathered. Very well thought of literary writer who had the reputation of being down on Austria. As an Austrian, he's very critical of Austria, the country, and the institutions, and especially the intellectual establishment to do with theater and writing. I knew the beginnings of that, but he's the kind of writer where I would say, if you go in blind, you're not really going to quite get it, or at least that's how I now feel. I didn't quite understand what I was getting into when you're reading someone like Bernhard. And I now have a better understanding, having read a little bit about his biography, just the beginning. I do want to read more. And in his case, his whole life is sort of, his writing is infused with his life experiences in an indirect way. But it's as if you can't really disconnect what he's doing in his writing from his whole life, if that makes any sense. And that I don't think that's the case with a lot of other writers, but some. So in this case, you kind of do need to know about his upbringing and where he came from. And in his case, so one kind of thing that, not knowing much about that and just seeing pictures of him, he just comes off as extremely sort of bourgeois, urbane, and kind of like sort of looking down his nose at a lot of other people because of his urbanity and his sophistication. Kind of sophisticated, I would say. He comes off as that. And yet, or perhaps because, so that's kind of a disconnect from his upbringing. So I'm going to read a little bit here. So Bernhard was born in Holland in a convent. His mother, unwed at the time, had fled there from Austria to give birth. After a year, she returned to her parents in Vienna, where her father and writer Johannes Freumbichler became the major influence on Bernhard. So his mother, I don't know much about her, but I know that she ran away for these reasons to give birth to him. So he's an illegitimate child. And she had to work in Holland, I recall. And so he wasn't with her a lot as a baby. And so the mother-child dyad there didn't happen, and she was sort of dismissive and neglectful of him to a certain degree, is what I'm gathering. And yet, so her grandparents step in, and one of the things about Bernhard is that he has a few people in his life that he calls his life people, that are kind of in his camp and support him, and that he loved, and that loved him back. And one of them was this grandfather, Johannes Freundbichler. So his upbringing is very unhappy in a certain sense. Here's another quote I found from an article online that I'll link to. It's called An Introduction to Bernhard, I think, and it says here, I'll just quote because it says it better than my rambling. Bernhard's life was marked by recurrent misfortunes, including the humiliation of an illegitimate birth and a childhood spent in part with a mother who never disguised her contempt for him. The physical illnesses that brought him several times close to death, he was a sickly being, like his whole life. He was quite ill. The loss of his beloved grandfather as the result of a misdiagnosed illness, and his discovery of stupidity, brutality, and mendacity as the ruling passions of his fellow Austrians. So this is what he thought of his fellow Austrians, except for his life people. And as I recall, the thing with the grandfather, all I remember is that, so in this novel, he is in this hospital, in this sanatorium for his lung cancer or tumor. And at some point, I don't know if it was this time, but there's another time when his grandfather was there too, or had been there, and maybe even died there in the same place that he was. Anyway, all the sad thing, the difficulties with his upbringing, and also he was kind of bullied, and in these institutes that he stayed in, these boarding houses, the extremely authoritarian people in charge, and I don't know anything firsthand yet, but I know that he thought of them as fascists, as National Socialists. Now, actually, I think they were, because it was 1943 when he was there at some point, and he has written about his terrible stays in these institutions. And so, of course, we can sort of understand where his, what I would call sometimes relentless seeming negativity vis-a-vis the world, vis-a-vis his fellow human beings, life in general, and that comes through in his writing, it's the source of that. And even in a sort of turnaround way, his urbanity and his sophistication and wanting to be seen as intellectual and comes from his upbringing. It's like the opposite. There's a bit of a Gatsby-esque quality to all of this, I think, in the sense that he recreates himself as this urbane, coffee-drinking person, and yet, he's always there's a gap between that, and he understands that there's a, not fakeness, but that he's playing a role in a certain sense. That his whole life was sort of role playing, and he was very interested in the theater and wrote plays too. Extremely critical of Austria plays, and then another thing that sort of is known about him. So his deep hatred for everything to do with Austria, his home country. He's Austrian. And to me, as a German person, the minute I have some videos of an interesting interview that I want to watch, the minute I hear his voice, this very, very specific the lilting Austrian cadence pegs him as completely Austrian for me as a German. It's a very distinct accent, different from any of the ones in Germany, different from Switzerland. It's the Austrian, and I think in his case, Viennese, or sort of urbane, because in Austria, there's differences in the dialects. If you're from a little town, it can get very hard to understand for me as a German. It's a different dialect. But the Viennese, lilting, high German, it's just, he's so Austrian. It sounds very, very Austrian to me. And so the other thing I wanted to just touch on is this famous thing that he wrote as he was dying, or he died at the age of 58, so pretty young, of his illnesses. And there's even a question of if it was an assisted suicide, but we're not sure. His will, released shortly after he died, forbade the publication, the production, or even the recitation in Austria of his works, quote, including letters and scraps of paper, for the next 70 years, the duration of their copyright. Quote, I emphasize expressly that I do not want to have anything to do with the Austrian state, and in that I reject in perpetuity not only all interference, but any overtures in that regard, he declared. So taking it on beyond the grave, his hatred for his own country that he's from. The other part I wanted to just touch on, this is all kind of tangential a little bit to the book, but it is important, is that he did kind of thrive on scandals and controversy. He kind of he saw himself, I just read a quote about him saying, I was always an irritation. I was always someone who disturbed. And so then he kind of takes on that and does it on purpose. And there's a scene in here, and there's actually a whole book where all it is his very negative and sarcastic reaction to being given literary prizes. He would stand up and make speeches, denigrating everyone, and he does it in here. I had a copy of one of the speeches he gave, but it was basically there was one where it was all about death, and I don't have it here with me, but so he would deliberately, and the thing is, he was given prizes quite a bit, and there's a part of him that wanted to be given prizes, but then he kind of dissed everyone who gave him the prizes, and it's borderline childish, but he was just he liked to irritate. He kind of thrived on that kind of negative attention, I guess. And so in here, the way he gives this negative speech, and then he sort of describes how the education minister, who'd gotten in his speech about Thomas Bernhard everything wrong and was sort of making him very angry. You see, there's this funny, it's almost, and he has this way of like describing scenes in a very movie-esque or theater-like way, and they all come running after him, and the minister wants to kind of hit him, and it's almost like a brawl. I mean, not quite, but, and him and his few people, his life people, they're standing there kind of huddling, trying to keep the masses away of people who are kind of up in arms about what he said. So yeah, that's the other thing. And now to get into the book. So the last time I talked about it, I was sort of skeptical about this little quote by Marcel Reich-Janitzky, who says on the back, "Never has Bernhard written in a more humane, or literally people-friendly, humane or tender way." And it's such a funny book because it's very negative. It's about how everything turns into something negative. Like, he's a person who's addicted to sitting in coffee houses, but he hates coffee houses, and he especially hates literary coffee houses. But it's an addiction of him because he did spend a lot of time in coffee houses. So he is basically a writer who spent time in these coffee houses, and yet he hates them. So there's always this sort of the loathing that he's projected, self-loathing in a certain sense. So all of this negativity, and Paul Wittgenstein comes along, who, of course, for Thomas Bernhard, who's sort of, in his Gatsby-esque wanting to belong to the upper echelons, and he kind of admits it, that the name was part of the allure for him to become friends with Paul. And then Paul was actually a sophisticated, very urbane, kind of not interested in really working or anything, and he didn't have to and at the end he didn't have much money because he spent all of the inheritance, but all he did was he was obsessed with music and opera, an opera addicted rich person, and they just hit it off. They were very critical of everyone else, and they were very into music and discussions about music. So they they geeked out in a kind of modern way about their passions, or he, at least Thomas, sort of was really interested in Paul because of Paul's eccentric passions for music and things like that. So they really became friends. And so that's one thing about Thomas. And there is one scene in here where at the end his play is put on, and he hates the play because they didn't put in the actors he wanted. He wanted Bruno Ganz, this famous Swiss actor, and he wasn't allowed to because apparently the actors decided they didn't want him. And so he's like, well, it's these Austrians who can't really act, and that's why they didn't want the Swiss guy. Bruno Ganz is a Swiss German. Anyway, and so after the play, everyone else is saying, oh, it was fine, and people were clapping, and he knows it was awful. He had to run away. He thought the staging of the play was so awful. And the only person who said, yeah, it was really awful, is Paul. The only one who kind of understands how upset and how awful it was seems to be Paul. And that's a bonding moment for him. And it truly is. So the people in his life, this grandfather, and Paul is one of them. He was one of his only friends. And I think his extreme sort of hatred of everyone means that the few people that he had, he really, really clung to. And if that's the word, clung. Can't talk anymore. And the other life person, and I want to find out more about this. So I've already told you how his mother kind of dismissed him, and I have this little kind of biographical snippet of, because of the trauma of the childhood and being unloved, he was a bedwetter apparently, and his mother, I think, would show the sheets to the neighbors to make fun of her son. So in a way, she bullied him too. I mean, how awful is that? Anyway, and so one of the life people with this was this woman, and I forget her name. Her name was Helga or Hedvig Stavianicek. Hedvig Stavianicek, who was about 37 years older than him. And so, you know, one cannot help but think a kind of a motherly person. Although, I mean, I'll have to look into it. I don't think they were a couple at all. His persona was asexual. I mean, he didn't really. Women apparently thought he was charming, and he's kind of good looking, in a kind of bourgeois sweaters, hair type way, you know. But apparently he didn't really go in for relationships. And so he has these life people. He has Paul, he has his older woman, he had his grandfather, and not that many other people. And so I think in a way the quote on the back is kind of true. This is, in all its negativity about doctors and how healthy people hate sick people, which for him, he's always on the side of the sick, and all the other, you know, things to do with Austrian culture. It is kind of an homage to his friend. It's a document his love for Paul. Well, in a certain way, Reinecke was right, but you have to kind of get to that point through all this negativity, because when I first started reading it, and even when I posted the one sentence, it seemed sort of like he'd made Paul seem like this flighty rich person who doesn't really care about anyone else. And I think in a way he was like that, but Thomas liked him. So it's as if there's a positivity behind the negativity. And I haven't even talked about the style of the language, which is, he has a way of writing, like all great writers, for me at least. The very simple fact is it compels you to continue reading. His sentences are long, but you want to keep reading because he just makes it sound so interesting. And I read another quote in somewhere, something to do with making even mundane actions sound interesting because of the way they're described. And I actually love reading about, you know, I remember with Uwe Jansson and the long things in Anniversaries about how she would interact with the New York Times. I love reading about that every day, like folding it. It's just all of that stuff. I love reading about everyday stuff, but made to sound interesting, if that makes any sense. And actually, Austrian writers, I mean, the other one, like the 19th century person, Stifter, he did that too quite well. Yeah, that's all I'll say. It's just he's a phenomenal writer. But you have to be careful. And I read this on Saturday, and because I wanted to finish it, but the negativity was getting to me. It's not. You have to be careful with someone who's really, really, really negative. So for your own internal disposition. And I don't know if anyone's ever people talk about this on BookTube a lot. It reminds me of a long time ago, an interview with the writer Doris Lessing, who went on and on about, if you listen to sad music, it can make you depressed, or like it can hurt you in a certain sense mentally. And I remember thinking, oh, that's not true. She's, you know, but I think in a way, there's something to that. Because I remember on Saturday, I was feeling very low, and it turned out it may have been to do with the fact that it was my mother's birthday anniversary, and she's passed a long time ago. But I remember thinking, just kind of falling into a bit of an abyss. I mean, not deeply, don't worry, but sort of having glimpses of how it must be to live as someone who's so sad and traumatized. And how you could, you know, I could sort of see a door opening to the darkness in a certain sense. And I'm glad it closed the next day, and you know, everything is fine. And it was sort of, there's sort of it was weird because it's almost like you feel like you're going to fall into this negativity and this sort of, is solipsistic, is that the right word? Or sort of not caring about anything, like truly not caring. And I think I said on my Goodreads interview something about a destructive character. And I think in a way, it's as if he gets his positive energy from being destructive or negative, if that makes any sense. Anyway, very, very off the cuff, preliminary thoughts on this fantastic book, but also not an easy book. And that's what I keep thinking when I was it's like his life was just really, really sad. But I think you could sort of twist it around and focus on the good parts too. I mean, he had and he has become famous. So he was a very well thought of writer. So he was a successful writer. And yet, part of the reasons are these dark things. I would recommend checking out the English translations of this one and some other ones. And I'll try and post some links to some articles if people are interested in Thomas Bernhard. Thanks all for watching. And let me know if you're interested or if you had read Bernhard. Another person that comes up with Bernhard, people see connections to, and I haven't read yet, is Samuel Beckett. So I want to kind of read Beckett and see if I see a connection there. I will talk to you very soon. Bye. Thanks for watching.